Good evening, everybody, and good evening, everybody watching. Thank you very much for tuning in and joining us this evening. This is the second of the Witness to the Union events we've run here at the Centre for Geopolitics as part of our UK Union programme. And the goal really is to bring to Cambridge people who've really been at the heart of the history of the Union over the last 20, 30 years and talk to them about their experiences and their understanding and their sense of where we go next. And today I'm delighted to welcome Lord Jack McConnell. Lord McConnell began his career, as we think of it, as General Secretary of the Scottish Labour Party from 1992 to 1998, that being a crucial year when he was a member of the Scottish Constitutional Convention that led to the establishment of the Parliament at Holyrood. He then served as Minister for Finance and Education and External Affairs before becoming First Minister in 2001, a post he served in until 2007. He's now a member of the House of Lords and has been since 2010. Lord McConnell, thank you very much for coming. I'm going to let this conversation be led by Professor Mike Kenny, who will be familiar to many of you as the Professor of Public Policy here at Cambridge and co-director of the Bennett Institute for Public Policy. So I'm not going to say too much more now. I'll come back in a bit later, but largely right now I'll hand over to Mike.
Thank you, Hugo, and thank you, Lord McConnell. Can I call you Jack?
I was going to say, can we just?
You're probably not used to having so many
stop that for a minute.
like formal stuff over. So I'm just going to put a few different questions, which cover broadly three areas. One, I'm going to take you right back to the beginning, your own involvement in the campaign for the restoration of the Scottish Parliament, and also the early history of the new institutions you're involved in. Then we'll move forward, look at that period when you were in government, then, of course, the rise of the SNP first in a minority government, 2007, and then a majority government. And then I want to get onto the more contemporary recent stuff that will probably be very much on people's minds. Brexit, some of the conflicts that's unleashed, and, of course, now what's happening in Scottish politics. Maybe the fall of the SNP, who knows, but certainly a shift in the tenor. So let's go back to the beginning. You were an early supporter of devolution. And can I just start by asking you, what was it? Was it a particular event or set of events that shaped that? Or was it, is this a sort of sentiment that just built up in you over some time?
Thank you very much for having me. Looking forward to the discussion. I always recall the now very controversial, at that time always a little bit controversial, former MP George Galloway, who used to talk about what he called the generation of 74. And by that he meant... I have to say George Galloway's older than me. I can just make that clear from I start. But he was talking about really a sort of decade of political activists and people in Scotland, cultural figures in Scotland and others, who were politicised at the same time, and a lot of different things were going on. The 74 references Scotland being in the World Cup at football for the first time in a generation, but and having a half decent international football team. But it was also a time when Scottish culture had a significant resurgence, particularly folk culture, Gaelic culture, radical playwrights. I vividly remember as a teenager watching a play called The Cheviot, the Stag and the Black Oil, which was about the history of Scotland and the ownership of land in Scotland and resources in Scotland. It was also a time when that sense of Britishness that came out of the Second World War was dissipating after the 60s and the breakdown of some of the sort of traditional paternalism of Britain. So you had in sport and politics and in culture and in society opening up, these changes all taking place, and then the injection of North Sea oil, which suddenly made Scotland as a political entity look maybe a bit more economically viable. So all of these different factors politicised a lot of us in our Scottishness in a way that I think has lasted a lifetime. And I cast my first vote in 1979 in the then devolution referendum for a very inadequate scheme, proposed by the Labour government, but one that we were very enthusiastic about. And the result of that referendum was disappointing for that generation. Some of us pursued the campaign, and then the campaign then moved on in the 80s to become it was quite kind of broken up by parties in the 70s, but in the 80s there was this idea that you might bring people together in a constitutional convention using various historical examples, and then agree a scheme that it would be almost impossible for any Westminster government to stand against. And so that was where the convention came from, and it was in 88 when Labour joined the convention. That was a big thing, big change for them. They had always gone their own way in the past. In any campaign in Scotland, they were so dominant that they didn't want to mix with other parties.
Can I just jump in on that?
Yeah.
So, because that is a big moment, isn't it, when
Yeah.
Labour come in to that? And I know there are a lot of
Yeah.
there's a lot of argument goes on in the years leading up to that, which I
Yeah, very
imagine
much
you were involved in.
of, yeah.
What can you just explain that shift? Because I mean, for people who don't know that story, it's an absolute key moment, isn't it?
Absolute key moment. Well, in the '79 referendum, the campaign for a yes vote for the then sort of half-hearted Scottish Assembly was split. There was a Yes for Scotland campaign that was a combination of most of the SNP, some had reservations, but most of them fringe parties like the Communist Party and others, the Liberals, individuals who were not in any party. And then there was the Labour campaign for Yes. And I think one of the reasons that was always identified for the poor result was that the campaign had split and hadn't had a unifying message to inspire people. So that was one of the motivations for those of us who were involved in the then campaign for a Scottish Parliament. When we proposed the idea of a convention, the idea was that we would try and unify the forces in advance of any future vote. And then Labour initially were very reluctant, traditional tribalism. There was a very interesting election result in 1987 when the Conservatives lost a lot of seats in Scotland. Labour won 50 out of 72 seats. And the Conservatives dropped, I think, to about a dozen seats. And that was the first time they'd ever been that low in Scotland ever in history. But they still stood against this idea of devolution. So the feeling at that point was that Labour had to make a change and do something dramatic. And that was when Donald Dewar, as then Shadow Secretary of State for Scotland, made the historic decision that Labour would join the convention, which of course it then dominated. It was the biggest force. So it was actually a very sensible decision because you then led the debate. Instead of being in the margins of the debate, you were actually right at the centre of it. And I was very fortunate to be part of that in the 90s. But a lot of the credit that should be given for the ultimate success in the proposals. Well, the initial decision was Donald Dewar's as a Labour figure to join the convention. And his Lib Dem colleague, then Malcolm Bruce, who's maybe known to people who had a very long, successful career as a Member of Parliament. They definitely came together and created the convention. The actual outcome where the convention agreed a full scheme that was then implementable was down to George Robertson, actually, who took over from Donald Dewar as Shadow Secretary of State for Scotland, and Jim Wallace, who eventually became Deputy First Minister for the Lib Dems. They were the leaders of Scottish Labour and the Scottish Lib Dems in the mid-90s. And they had a really disciplined approach to fixing every different aspect in a way that put together a proper scheme that could actually work in practice. And then shaped the legislation that ultimately has shaped the Parliament that has, despite all the difficulties in the last 20 years, the shape of the Parliament has stood the test of time.
And if you were to, I know different people had different views, and there was a whole sort of cacophony of voices involved in this, but how would you characterise the sort of expectations that people like yourself had? I mean, what did you think devolution was for? What was it going to do to Scottish politics?
Well, part of my passion for it was driven by my strong identity, but I was much more driven by the democratic deficit that actually was probably best encapsulated by Malcolm Rifkin, a Conservative, rather than anybody in the other parties, when he spoke about the fact that Scotland was the only place in the democratic world where you had distinct legislation, but not a distinct legislator to make that legislation. So in areas since 1707 in the Act of Union, Scotland had separate criminal and civil law, it had separate education system, still a distinctive and very separate church. All these things were preserved in the Act of Union, and subsequently, despite all the ups and downs of the 18th, 19th and 20th century, but the laws that were made for that distinct legislation were made in a parliament where Scotland had a significant minority of the seats, and it didn't fit. So that I was very motivated by that. Maybe I was a bit of a nerd when I was 18, 19, I don't know, but I was always very motivated by that democratic deficit. And so at the centre of devolution, yes, is partly Scottishness, but it is the fact that Scotland had always had a separate legal system, and that legal system was not governed by a legislative parliament in Scotland, an elected representative of Scotland.
Add on to that, I think Hugo.
Can I just come in on part of this process, which is that you have Labour and the Liberal Democrats thinking about what the Scottish Parliament would look like. You have this question of the democratic deficit and the democratic process. At what point did you settle on the mixed first past the post and proportional system, and why did you settle on that system?
Well, that was probably the most significant compromise. In almost every other area of policy, having identified the principles, it was relatively easy to work out what should be reserved and what should be devolved. I think if you've got if you can establish the principles that you want, for example, a single market across the UK, it's relatively obvious what needs to be reserved and what can be devolved. But if you want to then ensure that most public services are being governed at the most local level possible, it's relatively easy to identify what's devolved and what's reserved. The issues became much more difficult when it got to the structure of the Parliament. And the Liberal Democrats wanted a fully proportional system, single transferable vote, multi-member constituencies in the traditional model. The Labour Party initially, up until 1991, I think, wanted a first-past-the-post electoral system. And gradually, over a period of 4 years, the two parties debated and compromised and eventually agreed, I think maybe in 94, that the middle ground would lie in an additional member system where there were a significant number of first-past-the-post constituencies, and then there were additional constituencies that made the result more proportional. And the only argument after them was about the size of the Parliament. Some people, mostly outside of politics actually, wanted a Parliament of 200 people because they wanted a huge Parliament that everybody could be part of. Others wanted a small Parliament that wasn't going to cost very much and would be more popular with the voters. Again, there was a compromise reached, and the compromise was what was finally created, really, the 73 individual constituencies and the 56 additional constituencies, which was just not quite totally proportional, but near enough to keep everybody happy.
And that's on the
There was a theory, there was a reason for that on the Labour side. I mean, there were many of us on the Labour side who argued for a more proportional system for elections to the Scottish Parliament. And that was partly about reassuring those parts of Scotland who had been against devolution in 1979. So in the 79 referendum, most of central Scotland voted yes, and almost all of rural Scotland and Dundee, Aberdeen, places outside the central belt, voted no. I think Dundee was maybe the one that was out of step. But generally, the central belt voted yes. Those who were outside the central belt heard an argument that power would only move from London to Edinburgh, and you would be run by a big Labour authority from the central belt, and therefore you shouldn't allow this to happen. So we saw proportional representation as a reassurance to Scotland that voices from the whole country would be heard in this new Parliament, and we essentially won the argument at the time.
And that was also an argument going on with the British Labour leadership as well.
Oh yes.
Just give us a flavour of that, because there were some pretty tough arguments about all this, and who particularly were, obviously Donald Dewar was really key in Edinburgh, a number of other people. Who were the kind of, was it Blair himself? Was it people around Blair? Who was involved in that conversation?
Well, I think that's not written about a lot in this, is that Team Neil Kinnock played a role in all of this. Mr. Charles Clarke, who is part of this institution, when he was head of Neil Kinnock's office, when Neil Kinnock was leader of the Labour Party and leader of the opposition. Neil and his team, they wanted Labour's position on electoral reform to move slightly. And they set up a commission called the Plant Commission under Lord Plant, which I sat as a member of actually in 1990, which was tasked with looking at which aspects of elections in the UK could be Labour support being more proportional. What electoral reforms might Labour support? And that was what really opened the door to the British Labour Party supporting the Scottish Labour Party in developing a devolution scheme that had a proportional element. And they then went from there, really. And once we were in the convention and the British Labour Party had kind of said, look, this is a matter for you, but we can see the argument, then that then let the Scottish Labour leadership negotiate the agreement. And then it was, when Blair came in, there were people with big reservations about the PR element. I remember a conversation with Donald Dewar in the summer of 97, when the arguments were taking place in the Cabinet Committee about the legislation, where he was wondering, should he die in a ditch for this or not? And we basically agreed that it had been such a central feature of the convention discussions and the convention scheme that to move away from it would damage the whole project. And he won the argument. Yep.
And on the sort of government side, so I suppose moving forward, you're elected as MSP in the first election to the new parliament, and you become Minister of Finance. Again, I've read you talk about the sort of, it was just building from scratch. I mean, nothing was there. How did that, just talk us through that, and what were the biggest challenges in the really early days?
Well, the first thing is it all happened very quickly, which was both an achievement but also a massive challenge. Labour won the election in May 97. Blair had committed in advance to a referendum quickly on the convention scheme, or Labour's proposals, which were the convention scheme. The referendum took place in September 97 because we wanted that to happen quickly to come off the momentum of the election victory. But the white paper for the proposals for the Scottish Parliament was published in, I think, early July. So we went from an election in May, white paper in July, referendum in September. This was all top speed. For the British state, this was change at I never ever experienced before speed. And then after that, they had to get the legislation through Parliament. They had to then create, a number of preliminary organisations that would make the new Parliament happen in May 1999. And then, literally, I had never been a member of the Westminster Parliament. I had done some interesting jobs, but I had never been a member of the Westminster Parliament. I'd never taken part in a parliamentary debate. And 11 days after the election in May 1999, I was asked to become the new Minister for Finance. And I was told that I would take the first piece of legislation through the Parliament, that there was no finance department. There was a finance section, because basically what had happened was the civil service from the old Scotland office in the UK government had all been transferred over to the Scottish Parliament. But that was a civil service that was based on being a department in Whitehall, not in being a sort of government in waiting in Scotland. So I was given this job as Minister for... Actually, Donald Dewar himself thought there wasn't a job as Minister for Finance. He thought there wasn't a full-time cabinet job in it. So he threw in a few extras to keep me busy, including Europe, which is why I was just fortunate I was interested in that. I think a couple of other things. It made a job out of it all, which turned out to be a nightmare of a huge job. But there was no department. So there was somebody who became education minister, for example. There was an education department of the old Scotland office, and he took that department and he became the minister in that department. I was having to create a department from scratch and create legislation from scratch. I think, that was one of the big successes of the first 12 months, that there had been some thought outside of Parliament that had gone into this. There was, and what we did was we merged all the old public audit functions in Scotland, which were pretty disparate in different organisations. We created an Auditor General with a proper public audit committee to do the public audit side of finance. We created a budget mechanism that is pretty much still in place today, despite all the changes, and involves different stages in Parliament. It's more open than the UK budget legislative process, and we built a relationship, I think, with local government, which has been a bit more volatile, but also we're also able to finance them. So it was a fascinating time. It was an amazing time to become an MSP in the first ever Parliament, elected Parliament in Scotland. Was a remarkable honour to then be given that responsibility and take a Parliament through a debate on that bill that had no experience, really. I think there were maybe a dozen members of the first Parliament that had served at Westminster. So you're talking about a Parliament of over 100 people who'd never served in Parliament before. And the first thing they're asked to do in the autumn of 99 is agree in detail, clause by clause, the budget rules and the audit rules for public finance in Scotland. That was a time-consuming and challenging process, but it was great. And for me personally, it was fabulous, because what it gave me was an insight into every department. So I went from not having been involved in government to suddenly knowing all the little places where the money was hidden in different departments, and what people's choices were.
And I mean, looking back on that period, obviously, more generally, the untimely death of Donald Dewar is obviously a massive event in 2000, isn't it? And the 2000, it is 2000. Then you become First Minister in 2001.
Yep.
I mean, people forget now, things were pretty rocky at that time, and devolution. The polls suggested it was not that popular, and obviously there were issues about the cost of the building, but also there were various issues about performance in government. What is your memory of that period, and what was how did you sort of decide to go about sort of settling devolution, building popularity for it in the popular mind?
Oh boy. My close friend Andy Kerr, who became Health Minister when I was First Minister, and also was Finance Minister briefly as well, he and I used to talk on a Tuesday morning on the way into Edinburgh, and we had what we called the Tuesday morning feeling, which was, what on earth is going to happen this week? And there were basically a number of different factors. You had that sort of conflation of a small number of former Westminster MPs who were used to a certain style of debate and government that we were not trying to replicate in Scotland. The new Parliament was more open, more transparent, more, in theory at that time anyway, at least more collaborative. And I think the former Westminster politicians found that quite difficult. You then had over 100 completely brand new people who'd never served in a Parliament before, many of whom were very inexperienced, and that was a challenge. You then had this massive media core, which kind of almost appeared out of nowhere, because Scottish politics was not really that interesting apart from the occasional debate about devolution or independence. For most of the British media, it was this little added extra. It wasn't really that central, but they all appointed a minimum of one, sometimes 3 or 4 full-time reporters into Scotland in the summer of '99. And it just went crazy. Everybody's looking for stories. Everybody's looking for front pages. Everybody's looking for scandals. We had a massive scandal. One of the things that had been decided by Donald, actually, before the 99 election, was that on the day that the Parliament took its legislative power, every member of the Parliament would get a commemorative medal, it was called.
Right.
And this was given out, I think on the 30th of June or something, the day before we took the power on the 1st of July. And of course, the story was they've all given themselves, they haven't done anything yet, and they've all given themselves a medal. And it was chaos. People were, the younger, more inexperienced members were going to the parliamentary office and giving them back, and taking a photo for the local paper. I gave mine back. Some of the older ones were giving them to the local museum. They were a bit smarter about how they were doing it. More experienced people.
This is before social media, isn't it?
And this is without social media. This is just reporters, newspapers, television, and radio. And it was, and this went on for month after month after month after months. And sometimes the scandals were actually quite genuine, quite big issues. There had been a slight problem in that a commitment to EHCR had been written into the legislation. So the Scottish Parliament, Scottish Government had to act at all times in line with the European Convention on Human Rights. But they hadn't done a proper analysis of any areas where we might be out of step with that. And a very smart lawyer, smart in one sense, lawyer, spotted this, and he started picking up cases. And in particular, there was a very serious criminal who was allowed out of jail because of something that had happened that didn't quite fit in with EHCR, and that caused huge ructions across the new Scottish Government in August 99. So there were things that just hadn't been thought about, that were caught off guard. I think the civil service found it quite difficult to have politicians around them all the time. The Scottish civil service had operated a little bit like they were a department of Whitehall. They were based mostly in Edinburgh. Nobody ever really spoke to them or bothered them. They got on with the job. And suddenly they had 129 politicians breathing down their neck every day, asking them questions and sending them letters and things. So the whole system just buckled.
Do you think there was a cure for that? Do you think there was, if you'd gone slower in terms of establishing the Parliament, you would have minimised some of these issues? Or do you think it was just fundamental to setting up a new Parliament where there hadn't been one, is you have a large number of inexperienced MPs, or MSPs rather, who are going to find it difficult to adjust?
I have a lot of sympathy with those who put it together. I mean, the main architects were Donald Dewar, the first minister, and Henry McLeish, the second first minister, and they did a power of work. They and all their civil servants, an incredible amount of work to make all this happen in 2 years. And it's very easy with hindsight to say that they should have anticipated more of this. And I think it would have been very, very difficult to anticipate the scale of the media interest in detail. But I think it might have been smart to do a bit of a risk analysis on that, just in case. And I think some of the things that happened that were sort of almost accidental might have been avoided. And then, of course, there was the building. So, I mean, over all of this came a decision to build a new building for the Parliament, whereas it had been anticipated that an old building would be converted. And the promise from the referendum of a cost of £50 million to create a Scottish Parliament building was exceeded in a matter of weeks in the creation of the new building, and it eventually, I think, cost about 400 million. But that went on for about 5 years, and I mean, in terms of public confidence, that just drew everybody down. And it was, again, everybody was a bit caught because the decision to create the new building was made by the previous ministers in the Labour government. But as soon as the Parliament had its powers, the parliamentary building belonged to the Parliament and not the ministers. So you had these ministers who were getting the blame, Parliament that was now managing a project that was just too big for it, frankly, and its inexperience, and it just all got out of control, and that really had a massive impact on public confidence. And actually, the day we moved into the new building, although the building itself has always been a little bit controversial, it was a bit of a turning point in 2004 where I think we were able to sort of shift and move on a little bit.
Just following that, I was going to ask, when do you think devolution sort of became embedded in sort of Scottish politics? Was it, that's one moment? I guess it's a succession of moments. Is it events?
I think it's two moments. There's actually there's three. The referendum was very important. The referendum was controversial, partly because of the lack of success in the referendum in '79. People who supported home rule of any kind in Scotland, whether it was a moderate devolution or strong devolution, which I supported, or independence, were very nervous about referenda because of what had happened in '79. But in the spring, I think, of '96, Tony Blair and his team were thinking through being in government rather than just being in opposition and winning. And they had identified getting the legislation for a Scottish Parliament through the House of Lords as a major block on progress, and that it could take several years. The House of Lords could block this. It could be a really, really, really difficult time. And they basically hit on the idea that if you held a referendum before you put the legislation through Parliament, then Parliament couldn't stand in the way. And it was a masterstroke. And I remember the day he told me. I was called into the office. I was given a glass of wine. They were obviously nervous about my response. And immediately I said, I think this is brilliant. I think this is just a masterstroke. And I fell out with a lot of friends over it by supporting the idea, but it proved to be right. And
because it was unpopular, wasn't it?
It was very unpopular in Scotland at the time, but the actual referendum result was overwhelming. And therefore, so that was a moment when the idea of a Scottish Parliament became very real. The next moment was on the day that the Parliament was launched, partly with its powers on the 1st of July, 99. And that was partly, I think, the very firm endorsement of the Queen. She was there properly. This has happened. This is part of the structure of the UK now. We hope it's a success. And that does help with people in terms of stabilising nerves and worries. And it was partly the conduct of the ceremony and the general feeling of hope and expectation there was there, which then went downhill a bit over the next few years. And then the third moment, and I think this is really interesting, the moment when I think devolution in Scotland really grew up and people, really started to accept it as part of the fabric of life in Scotland, was the day that the smoking ban came into existence in 2006. So there had been a huge debate across the UK about whether to have a ban on smoking in public places after Ireland had introduced a smoking ban, I think, in 2003. Big debate in the British cabinet. They had decided not to go for it. There was a big split in the Blair cabinet over it. We held a consultation in Scotland. I was initially at the beginning of the consultation as First Minister opposed to the idea. But through the consultation, every single piece of evidence that we received from young people over the course of 6 months supported a ban of some kind. And I thought, well, this is about their future. And I could tell you the whole story, but to keep the story short, we did decide to go ahead with it. We announced that we were going to go for a full ban. We implemented some really top quality legislation. Andy Kerr, who I've already mentioned, was the health minister who put the legislation through Parliament. It was top quality. We then had a top quality marketing campaign to let people know when it was going to happen. I think it was the 26th of March, 2006. It was a Sunday. We chose a Sunday when the clocks changed. So it was the shortest day of the year. It was a Sunday, less likely for people to be going out to pubs and things. All sorts of weather reasonably good. People could go outside and not be too worried about being inside if they wanted to have a cigarette. People across Scotland held last fag parties on a Saturday night in pubs and places. And everybody said there was a massive campaign, a really big multi-million pound campaign against the law by the tobacco industry, which was very personal about me, but also, really putting fear into people and encouraging them on the margins to challenge this new law. And there were not one incident or arrest in Scotland on the Sunday, the whole country. And that was the day when people in Scotland accepted that the Scottish Parliament could pass a law that they might not agree with, but they would obey. And I think that's the key moment of the last 20 years in Scottish politics.
So that's taken us up to the mid-2000s. So
yep.
The political weather is changing.
Oof.
Obviously, this is the more painful bit. Obviously, the SNP is starting to become very competitive.
Gathering storms.
Well, notice we just moved quickly past the fact that I did actually win an election.
Yeah.
20 years ago this week.
Jack, I was taking that as
no, I'm only joking.
Everyone knows that.
20 years ago this week on the 1st of May, 2003.
We'll allow you a small celebration
but,
anniversary.
It wasn't so good 4 years later.
But then let's move to the difficult bit. I mean, there is it's a huge question, and it's as a whole, vast industry of trying to explain that shift, and particularly the collapse of Labour. What is your? I mean, there are a number of different explanations that people have put forward. I mean, one element of this that I was just interested to hear you talk about is this sense that in Scottish politics, Labour figures, a lot of really ambitious people went to Westminster and didn't actually come into the Edinburgh Parliament. Is there a sense that Labour became complacent? That the sort of signals that came out of the Labour Party were picked up by the Scottish people, or was it about governance? Was it about policy difficulties, or are the political times just changing for other reasons? What's your take on
that? It's a combination of factors, but it should not be minimised that this was one of the first populist administrations, and after 2007, that the rise. I took the view, partly because I felt it myself, that from the 70s onwards, that identity became increasingly a factor in people's decision making and how they felt about their society, not just themselves, through the 70s, 80s and 90s. And that was happening around the world. It wasn't just happening in Scotland. Scotland's maybe just ahead of the game. But I think that whole rise of identity politics meant that there was going to be a moment where this shift started to happen. I think there was a bit of complacency about it after the 2003 election, when the SNP had gone down a bit from the 99 result, but we could sense it coming. Certainly those of us on the ground in Scotland could sense it coming. It also wasn't out of step with international examples. So, for example, in Catalonia in Spain, the main Catalan nationalists ran the Catalan government for 20 years after Catalonia got devolution. The Parti Québécois in Quebec in Canada, there have been occasional breaks in their power in Quebec, but it's pretty relentless over the years, the level of support they've had in Quebec, even when support for independence for Quebec has gone down. So in these sort of if I can call them sub-state political institutions, people do vote for nationalists. They do in Bavaria, for example, in Germany. They have. I don't think the Bavarian Christian Social Democrats have never lost an election. I think.
How can I put it?
So to some extent, it was always going to come. In terms of the context at the time, sorry, you did ask me a bit more widely. You had a Labour government that had been in power for 10 years. A little bit tired. You had the Iraq War, so we'd lost some support from people who were anti-war and concerned about Labour's approach on that front. That definitely affected support. I think you had a slight feeling that there was something about Labour's approach to Scotland that was a little bit reluctant to really go with this new parliament in the sense of where we were, and that was shown. It was shown in issues that were not, top of the range political issues, but there was a feeling, a sense that at the centre, Labour had a reluctance to go with the flow on where Scotland was going, and that definitely, I think that made people hesitate with their traditional loyalties, and that opened up the space into which a relatively populist leader of the SNP, Alex Salmond, with a number of offers for sort of retail offers on freezing council tax, abolishing council tax, and various other things, stepped into that, made them an offer, and people went for it.
Just one quick follow-up, then I know Hugo wants to come in. I mean, really, just to probe a bit, that reluctance, that's a very interesting word to use. Can you, I know it's difficult, but can you be a bit more specific? Who are you thinking about here? Are you talking about MPs in Westminster? Do you mean the Labour leadership? Is this something sort of, deep, almost cultural, that Labour didn't get on board with devolution despite having introduced it?
I think it was twofold. It was partly that Labour's Scottish MPs had not really anticipated the fact that they were no longer going to be the only important person in town, and suddenly they had a competitor locally for local publicity, for local standing, for local status, and they felt uneasy about that and very protective of their positions. So they had, in some cases, 20 years as an MP, being involved in all sorts of issues locally, whenever they wanted to be. And suddenly this MSP was responsible for education, for health, for criminal law, for, economic development, for local government, and so on. That created tensions, but it also had an impact, I think, at the high echelons of government, where Scottish MPs at the high echelons of government were more reluctant to work with us as Scottish ministers than, for example, Charles Clarke was.
So it varied. There's some variation.
Yeah, and then I think so that was part of it. But I think that there's also a political point, which is that the British Labour Party, although it had initially been a very strong Home Rule party, set up and led by a Scot initially, had become, in a social democratic tradition, about the redistribution of wealth across the UK. And I think the Labour Party found it hard to move away from that overriding principle that the purpose of Labour was to get into government across the UK and redistribute wealth and power across the UK, and to lose a bit of the power over that, I think was quite. It wasn't just emotionally challenging, but it was politically challenging for the social democratic approach of the Labour Party.
I'm just conscious of time. I know people have questions they want to ask, so we'll move forward to the world of referendums various on independence and Brexit, I think.
Yeah, so just two questions, if I go to on that. I mean, there's so many more questions I'd love to speak to you, but no,
talk all night on
it's
this.
Fascinating stuff. 2014, so the Scottish referendum. How does that result look now? Is that a good result for the union, or an indication of problems, deep-seated problems in unionism?
I think that my own view, it's not necessarily a popular view with many of my colleagues and friends, is that the 2014 referendum kind of showed everything that was going wrong on both sides. On the unionist side, that should have been a comfortable victory. 9 months out, it was going to be a comfortable victory. But they were complacent. They got the tone wrong from the announcement in February of, you can't use our pound by the three, by Chancellor George Osborne, Shadow Chancellor Ed Balls, and Danny Alexander, who was like this guy on the side. They announcing that that Scotland was not going to be allowed to use the pound. I think I got texts that day from people who were lifelong unionists who told me they were going to vote yes in September. And I think that set a tone for the rest of the year that was uncomfortable. I think there was a real complacency. I met one senior, very senior UK political figure at the Commonwealth Games in Glasgow in 2014. He was kind of wandering around on his own, nobody to talk to, and he sort of sidled over and asked me how I thought the referendum was going to go. I said, I think it's going to be close. I think the SNP will be very well organised coming out of these games for the last month. It's going to get close. You guys are going to panic. And he literally went, nah, and walked away. And, you know, he should have been, I mean, I've not been vain about this, but he should have been asking for my advice, not wandering up and then dismissing it and walking away. And I think they just got it completely wrong. And I think they also, they didn't have a positive message. They didn't have it was all far too negative. There was no reason for the UK to exist. And I think this has been one of the biggest political failures of successive UK governments and political parties now in opposition and in government, that they are unable to articulate why the UK needs to exist in the 21st century. And I think until that happens, you're not going to reverse the tide, particularly amongst young people, of people thinking there's no point to it. On the other side, you know, I think we also saw in that campaign the darker side of nationalism, and I think some of the abuse that people took, the sort of general behaviours on the street. But there's a little bit of that on the unionist side as well. But there was an element of nastiness crept into the campaign, and a sort of denial of it by the hierarchy that was then perpetuated in the years that followed. And so we've now got this horrific situation in Scottish politics where on both sides, people are, you know, they're so divided and they're so entrenched that it's an almost impossible political environment to inject debate about ideas and values and so on. Really, really hard in political environment.
And so the question that follows from that, I guess, is so SNP in government, it's a long period of one party rule. And that has had lots of consequences, among which is a sort of debate, sometimes I suppose a degree of skepticism and criticism for the institutions of a devolved government, and the question of whether there are enough countervailing powers and sort of forces in Scotland to that sort of situation. And it's triggered quite a wider angle debate about devolution, both in Scotland but also in London, parts of the Conservative Party as well. Just interested in your take on that, and I suppose to put that into an even bigger question, looking back now, knowing what you know now, would you think the model that you were absolutely key in one of the architects of, would you change it? Would you do anything different or build it differently?
Okay, how to answer this quickly? This is impossible to answer quickly. I'll try and do that. The model of the Scottish Parliament, as it currently is created, was based on a desire to have a different type of politics from what we had seen in Westminster prior to 99. Unfortunately, I think that model has not coped with the more partisan, divided Scottish politics of the last decade or so. So we now have a real, and it was never anticipated through the additional member system that a party that didn't win 50% of the vote could have a majority of seats in the Parliament and therefore dominate the Parliament's committees and so on. So it's what that's led to is a lack of checks and balances inside the Parliament. That's, I think, my view is it's really unhealthy for the ministers. I mean, I know that ministers see this as a criticism of them, but actually, in my view, ministers are at their best when they're being challenged. Yeah. When they've got something to say, which they should have, but also when they're being challenged on what they've actually delivered. And I think the whole system is really in some difficulty. there's a lack of internal checks and balances in the Parliament. You've also seen alongside that, unfortunately, a decline in the size of the media. It was far too big in '99, but it's now far too small. So there are no checks, very little checks and balances outside of Parliament. And you have this divided political culture, which actually hasn't changed very much. One of the most remarkable things about Scotland since 2014 is, despite the aftermath of that referendum in the year or so following, despite Brexit, despite having probably the three worst British governments in living memory, and by living memory I mean like really old people's living memory. The Theresa May, Boris Johnson and Liz Truss governments were not exactly reasons to stay in the UK. The figures on support for independence or opposition to independence are almost exactly the same as they were in 2014. Now that's a remarkable situation. That's almost unique in the Western world. You look at political debate and voting across the Western world and how volatile it's been in the last decade. In Scotland, it's been like that since 2014. Now, that should tell us all that there's something wrong with our politics. So that's you asked me what I would look back on. Small things that might not be too meaningful to everybody here, but that I think could help change a little. I think we made a mistake with the additional member system. I'm still very much in favour of a proportional parliament, but I think the lifelong, and I know this is a bit ironic coming from a member of the House of Lords. Someday I hope to vote for the abolition of the House of Lords. So hopefully I will not be there lifelong. But I think the almost lifelong position of people who are coming in off party lists into the Parliament is unhealthy for democracy in Scotland, because those people owe their allegiance to the party rather than the electorate. And I think that is unhealthy and needs to be challenged in some way. Two different ways you could do that. You could have people time limited on the lists, or you could have people only able to stand on the list if they've stood in a constituency or something like that. But I think there needs to be more local accountability and all of that. I think I've never been in favour of a second chamber, and I'm still not in favour of a proper second chamber in Scotland. But more than enough politicians that we know what to do with. But I think we could have a scrutiny chamber that was a bit different from the House of Lords. One of the ideas I floated last year was you could have a chamber where maybe local government was represented. So you could have 2 reps for every city, 1 for every other local authority, with maybe other special interests also represented on some sort of elected or selected basis from organisations in that area of interest. Their job being to scrutinise legislation and budgets before they are approved by the actual elected Scottish Parliament. So not to be involved in amending it's like a pre-legislative consultation exercise with people who've got some legitimacy, and then maybe a post-legislative scrutiny of ministers' performance after legislation. I don't know if that's the right formula, but I think we need to think creatively about how we can spice it up a bit, and create better challenge. Because in my view, as I said, I think ministers who are challenged. I never wanted a minister in my cabinet who wasn't up for the challenge of having to explain themselves in debate. And I think it's unhealthy for democracy if you don't have enough of that. And a parliament at its core, what are the sort of 3 things for a parliament? You've got to create good legislation. By and large, the Scottish Parliament has done. A few mistakes, but by and large, it's done that. You've got to speak for Scotland, which I think it probably has done in different ways over the years. But you've also got to hold the executive accountable. And I think the holding the executive accountable bit is the bit that I think is failing at the moment.
Thank you.
Okay, so what we're going to do is we might have time for Mike and I to ask a couple more questions later, but right now we're going to go to the audience, and I can see questions already, and Jack's going to run around, and I'm going to start with Claire.
it's not very earth-shattering, but you began by talking about a generation of 74 and they getting politicized and entering politics. And I'm thinking there should have been a generation of 14, maybe 40 years later, politicized. But why? What do you think young people are entering Scottish politics now, burned up about? Because it seemed a bit as if the SNP leadership election, that there wasn't an alignment between the key issues that were causing division and actually what the Scottish electorate were concerned about in the bigger picture, as an outsider.
Mm-hmm. That's an interesting question. Yes, I think people talk about Nicola Sturgeon being a very good communicator, and one of her great skills was, and this was from the very first moment she became First Minister in 2014. She was almost able to sort of ride above the political storm or any of the other kind of day-to-day political arguments that were going on, and that it was a fantastic skill to have. But it was also partly because of the tribalism that came out of the referendum. So you had sort of just under 50% who were very loyal to where they had been in the referendum, and the other side similar. And I think as long as she was in position, or at least for 5 or 6 years in that position, what that meant was that unless it was an issue that she was personally driving, other political issues there certainly wasn't open debate on other political issues. And I think what the SNP leadership election showed was that actually underneath Nicola, there are very different voices in the SNP, very different political views. They are united by one cause, but they did have over these years actually quite strong views that maybe weren't being expressed publicly. So, and I think this, I don't think we would ever have thought that the election of a new First Minister would necessarily open up Scottish politics, but it is possible actually that. Because of the challenges that Humza Yousaf is now facing as First Minister, and various other changes in personnel that are happening in the party, that he has no choice but to open up debate rather than close it down. And if that happens, you could find Scottish politics could become very interesting again. And because one of the things that happens when one party is dominant and they are very, very disciplined, other parties think they have to copy that route. It's a mistake that New Labour made, copying what they saw as the successful model of Margaret Thatcher, strong discipline and so on. I think at times they forgot that actually Margaret Thatcher had some quite strong dissenting voices in her cabinet, and she was confident enough to deal with that. And I think it will be interesting to see how this develops now. There's maybe a moment when we could have a real debate, and there are things that are crying out for debate. I mean, and I don't mean I'm not saying this in a party political sense. I would blame UK governments for this as much as Scottish governments. When I was sorry for the long answer, but
no worries.
I'll give you an example. When I was First Minister, I used to meet 6 Scottish firms twice a year, the chief executives, because they were the people with the biggest level of economic activity that affected different parts of Scotland. One was the Royal Bank of Scotland. One was the Bank of Scotland, HBOS, Halifax Bank of Scotland. One was Scottish Power. One was Scottish and Newcastle, the big brewery company. Scottish and Southern Energy, SSE, now a big renewable firm, and Standard Life, who were the insurance firm. The Royal Bank of Scotland is a shadow of its former self after the banking crash of 2008. The name RBS is hardly used in England now, whereas at that time they were phasing out NatWest and using RBS everywhere and around the world as well. At that time it was the 5th biggest bank in the world. HBOS Bank of Scotland is not owned in Scotland anymore. It's owned by Lloyds. Scottish Power is owned by a Spanish firm. Scottish and Newcastle is owned by a Greek-led consortium from Europe. Standard Life is now part of Aberdeen Asset Management. And SSE is the only one of the 6 that is still a sole registered headquartered company in Scotland. There has never been a proper debate since 2008 in Scotland, 15 years now, about how do you replace all that economic firepower for the banks. Those banks were paying for accountants and lawyers and marketing spend and designers and cleaners and administrators and everything across Scotland, and they collapsed. And we've never had a debate on how do you replace that economic firepower. Maybe it's in renewable energy, maybe it's in high tech engineering and design, maybe it's in banking and finance in another way, asset management or something. And I blame both the UK government and the Scottish government for that. But because they've been so entrenched in this debate about the Constitution, we've never opened it up. And I think this new political environment might just finally see that.
Okay, Brendan,
fingers crossed.
and then there. So Brendan first, and then
Thank you very much. It's been a really interesting conversation so far, and I apologise that I have to leave at 10:02. My question is to do with unionism as a transcendent force.
Mm-hmm.
So what's the justification, given the challenge that now exists and has done for quite some time, from the SNP to the integrity of the union? What's the justification for having three unionist parties facing effectively, I know there's the Greens, but effectively one party which wants to leave the union? Because that obviously condemns Scottish unionism to very much a minority position within Westminster, and optically that is very, very bad for the union. So I'd be interested to hear your view on that.
Well, I mean, the three main unionist parties have different political values, so they operate in different political spaces. So they need to do that in Scotland as much as they need to do it anywhere else in the UK. The biggest problem for those parties, and occasionally people have tried to deal with this. Michael Gove would be an example of maybe somebody who has at least tried to use his brain and think about what might happen differently. But the biggest problem has been that in those main parties, they have not challenged themselves in Westminster and Whitehall to think about a new way of governing the UK. You cannot govern the UK with a very strong devolved parliament with tax varying powers in Edinburgh, an increasingly strong parliament and voice in Wales, and potentially someday, hopefully, a stable and powerful institution in Belfast. You cannot govern the UK that has those institutions in the same way as you governed the UK prior to 1999. It just doesn't work. And I don't think you can announce budgets by surprise in the great British tradition of the Chancellor turns up with his budget and surprises his cabinet colleagues, never mind the Parliament and the country. That wouldn't happen in Germany. There would be discussions beforehand with the Lander about a budget before a finance minister announced the annual budget. Same in other parts of the world. And we need to adapt the centre of the British state to operate in a different way. Whitehall, I would abolish the old Secretaries of State for Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. Create a big Department of the Union. I wouldn't necessarily call it the Department of the Union. Maybe a Department of Internal Relations or something like that. But that would be responsible for relations with Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, and maybe English local government as well. But the Secretary of State for that department would be the most powerful person in the cabinet after the Prime Minister. Incredibly powerful cabinet position. And whereas at the moment, what you have in the margins of cabinet is people who are on the first rung of the ladder, talking to Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland, and just so they feel neglected. So I think you need to restructure the British system of government, and there's lots of other things you can do. I think the civil service, for example, could be fundamentally changed in order to deal with this new situation as well. But it has to come from the centre. The people at the centre need to stop complaining about the devolved governments and start actually looking at themselves and change, because that's the only way you're going to inspire a younger generation of voters in Scotland and Wales, and increasingly Northern Ireland as well, to accept that they have any legitimacy in their lives.
I was very struck by your remark earlier that the decision about which powers should be devolved and which should be reserved, you thought was taken relatively easily in the convention. So, I mean, two comments and then a question. So the comments, I voted Edinburgh North and Leith, and when I get the leaflets through the door for UK elections, all the candidates are saying things like, I'm going to campaign for your local primary school. I say, no, that's devolved. Nothing to do with you, mate. That's not a UK decision. And the other comment is, I think the Scottish people seem to be relatively slow to work out which powers are devolved. I mean, Scots throughout history have loved blaming the English for everything. And I find in the pub in Edinburgh, I hear people, they're still blaming the English for things, and I'm the pedant who interrupts and says, no, that's devolved. That's Sturgeon's fault. I mean, flooding in Scotland, that's a devolved matter. That's not the fault of the UK Parliament. So those are the comments. The question is, do you think this is stable in the future? I mean, we're starting to have challenges, and gender recognition is the obvious one, which has been blocked by the UK government. But also, the Scottish government is starting to use its powers to vary the income tax rates, which are now beginning to be significantly different from England. So how much more pressure is there? Or do you think that the settlement between Westminster and Holyrood is stable for the long term?
I worry a bit about the settlement in the shape that it's in now. I think the amendments to the settlement have been a bit... because it's going to sound stupid, a bit bitty. I think making the odd change to the powers, which is essentially what happened after the Calman Commission and the Smith Commission, and the two big pieces of legislation. I don't think it helps that level of accountability and understanding and clarity. There was a clarity to the original scheme. It needed development in terms of more tax powers to Edinburgh. But beyond that, there was a coherence to the idea that the single market was a UK-wide thing. And certain pieces of legislation, therefore, had to stay at the centre. But the whole reserved, devolved split, if it wasn't reserved, therefore it was devolved, actually worked well in practice. It gave everybody a clear understanding. And where there was a need for change or an opportunity in change, it was possible through the mechanisms of the Scotland Act to do that. For example, the original devolution scheme, one of its bigger mistakes was to devolve trains, but not the track. So for the first few years, it was quite difficult having a railway strategy. But in 2004, 2005, when Alistair Darling was the Transport Secretary, we devolved the track, and therefore we were able to do, I think, quite interesting things on the railways that to some extent have stood the test of time. So I think we need to be very careful on this. One positive and one negative comment. A positive comment: I think as tax rates change in Scotland, differently from England, people will pay much more attention to what the Scottish Parliament is doing and what the local MSP is voting for in a budget. So while those tax changes might be a bit uncomfortable for people who are paying a bit more over a certain salary range, it will spark off interest amongst voters, and that will be a healthy thing. On the negative side, we've almost stopped, because of the relations between the two governments, we've almost stopped finding particular solutions in Scotland within reserved areas without devolving them. Not always necessary. So, for example, I mentioned Charles Clarke earlier. When Charles was Home Secretary, actually starting under his predecessor, David Blunkett, but when they were Home Secretaries, we agreed a scheme where people could get a visa to live in Scotland for 2 years from other countries easier than they could get it elsewhere in the UK. At the time, people said, they'll just all come to Scotland and then go elsewhere in the UK. It didn't happen. It was a massive success. It helped us turn around population decline. It was a great public policy initiative that was implemented by the Home Office, but at our request, and we then did the delivery of it at a local level. And there's no reason why the UK government departments couldn't be more responsive to situations in Scotland or Wales or Northern Ireland. And I think that's what I mean about changing the way the UK government operates. But I do agree with you that tax changes will spark off a bit of interest and maybe improve accountability.
Okay, right at the back. Yeah.
Yes, thank you very much.
Can you just wait for the mic, my friend, so that you can be heard by the millions watching?
I don't think we're quite in Eurovision territory.
Nah, not quite. We have aspirations. Go on.
Thank you very much. You mentioned a second house, and I wonder if you think a reformed elected second house, whether it represents the regions or local authorities, as you suggested, might undermine the case for independence successfully. Thank you.
Hang on, just to clarify the question, is that at a Scottish level or at a UK-wide level?
This is at a UK-wide level. Yeah, replacing the House of Lords, for example.
Yes, absolutely. I don't think we should do it just because it would deal with some of the motivations for independence. But I think it would help people feel that the UK state was more representative. So that would be a good thing. It goes without saying that the House of Lords has to be reformed. It's a piece of nonsense that you've got 800 or 900 people, most of whom are over retirement age. When I joined 12 years ago, I was very much one of the youngest. I am still one of the younger ones. But beyond that, you can't justify a system that's basically replaced hereditary privilege with political patronage and entitlement. I think there is a big choice to be made in reforming the House of Lords. If I can just divert into that for a second, about whether you actually have a fully elected chamber or not. I am not in favour of a partially elected chamber. I think that would be a disaster. But I'm not convinced by a fully elected chamber, because I think that might cause problems with the House of Commons and its primacy. I think the House of Lords, if it exists, or a Senate, if it exists, should be there to scrutinise and assist the House of Commons, not to replace it. And I'm quite tempted by the idea of indirect election of some form to the House of Lords. I had lots of conversations with the late Robin Cook, about this when he was leader of the House of Commons back in when I was First Minister. And one of the ideas that he was toying around with at that time was that you might have a House of Lords that was appointed, but appointed from the bottom up rather than the top down. So you would have some sort of legislative body in each, or legislative creation in each of the regions of England and in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, that would each appoint a certain number of members of the House of Lords for maybe a 6 or 7 year term of office on a rotational basis. So you always had a turnover. And they would have to be people of certain standing, and there would be certain criteria and principles and so on. So people would be appointed from the bottom up rather than the top down, but it would still be appointed and be a scrutinising chamber rather than a elected chamber that challenged the House of Commons fundamentally. And I still think that's quite an interesting idea. It's not really part of the public debate at the moment, but I don't think the House of Commons is ever going to vote for a fully elected House of Lords. And I think we need to be very creative in thinking what they might actually support and vote for at the end of the day.
Okay. Yes, question all the way the other way.
Yeah, thanks. I suppose I've got two questions, but I'll keep it to one. I suppose on the last point, just throw in the idea of a House of Citizens as an example, but I'll leave that for now, because that's probably a much longer conversation. But my real question is what you think that Keir Starmer and Anna Sarwar can do to have a sustainable Labour recovery in Scotland. I think at the moment there's a big opportunity politically with sort of turmoil in the SNP and the Conservatives, both of which have had long governments in Scotland and in the UK. So this could be a great opportunity for Labour to come back in Scotland. The question is, how can they retain that and make it sustainable?
You win elections by convincing people it's worth voting for you. I think in relation to in both Scotland and in the UK, I think Keir Starmer and Anna Sarwar will be successful if they are able to articulate a vision for the country and a set of symbolic policies that will show to people that they can make a real difference to their lives that is better than what's already on offer. that's the challenge, I think, for both of them, that they're both grappling with. I think on Scotland in particular, I think UK Labour, I would say that I think we need to signal that we would change the way the UK government would operate, and that we would understand that the UK has changed, and that in Scotland and in Wales, I don't think we can take Wales for granted. That there's a different sense of identity and political culture that needs to be more respected. And on the other side, I think, while we have probably our most energetic and charismatic leader in the Scottish Labour Party that we've had for a very long time, I would say, again, Anas Sauer, I think his big challenge is to try and hold the Scottish government accountable for the decisions they make, which is difficult. But we find creative ways of doing that, but also set out a policy platform that people can really believe in, and that they believe is about their lives and not just about the Labour Party. The Labour Party has far too often over the years spoken to, and this is not just a Scotland and Wales thing, it's maybe part of what happened in the north of England at the last election. Far too often has spoken to places like they didn't really exist, and what mattered was how the Labour Party was faring, not how they were faring, and people who were living in those places were faring. And I think we need to recognise that where people are, their place is a really, really important part of modern political debate. And I think that's as true in many parts of England as it is in Scotland and Wales. And within Scotland and Wales, it's very relevant. So, Labour Party was successful in Scotland in the 90s and in the early part of the noughties for many reasons. But I think we were speaking for the whole country at times. And, the idea that, I used to use the slogan that the Labour Party was Scotland's real national party. And certainly that's what we should try to be, because we should represent rural as well as urban. We should represent prosperous as well as poor and so on. And because that was in the national interest, and what's in the national interest, if you can then make change, can really deliver for those who are most vulnerable. So I think you need to find a way of articulating that again, and we need to find sharp policies that emphasise the difference between us and others that people can believe in.
Mike, do you want to come back in momentarily on a couple of things?
Well, if restrict me to one question, I suppose it's a question that follows your earlier answer about how stable this will be moving forward. Isn't there another sort of set of reasons for potential instability? Is that this is no longer just a bilateral relationship, is it, between the Scottish government and the UK government? Other parts of the UK are increasingly implicated in all of this. This is a multi-dimensional system, isn't it? The demand for changes to the Welsh settlement has been driven to a considerable degree by what Scotland's got. And then England, which you just mentioned, clearly perceptions in England have shifted over time. There's not been a sort of huge groundswell of opposition to devolution elsewhere, but it may be an element of jaundice about what's been offered elsewhere compared to England, and also the lingering issue of the fiscal question, who's paying for this, and the Barnett formula, all of that. So is it feasible to think of this, for any further reform without actually the centre looking at the union as a whole? And isn't it goes to your point about a department for the union? Do we need now to think about devolution in the round if we're going to have more of it?
Yes, absolutely. I'm just not. I'm not in favour of piecemeal changes to these settlements. I think the Welsh settlement was very much a sort of let's give them a little bit to keep them happy sort of approach, which almost failed in the Welsh referendum in 97. The Scottish settlement was really well thought through, and to make piecemeal changes to that, I think it's quite dangerous with the overall settlement. And I do think you need to have an overview for the UK. I think before you start to look at the overview for the UK, you have to have a vision for the UK. Why does the UK exist? What is it about these islands, about our common, those aspects of our culture that are common, those aspects of our identity that are common. What is it we share, and why do we share it? And if you start from that point of view, and then develop a structure that can work in practice, I think you're much more likely to be successful. If you start from the point of view, the natives are a bit restless, you need to give them a bit more. I mean, it's not a sustainable position, but that. In far too many times in the past, that has been the approach. On the other side of the coin, the worst way that the UK political parties could respond to the current turbulence in the SNP is to get complacent and say, well, okay, we can just ignore Scotland and Wales again. That would just be bonkers. Sends all the wrong signals. So I actually quite like the fact that Keir Starmer has been in Scotland a lot over the last few months. I know it's partly because there might be a by-election coming up, and so on, but I do like the fact that he's not taking the foot off the gas just because the SNP's been having a few difficulties. I like the fact that Jeremy Hunt went to Edinburgh and announced a package of financial reforms.
Yeah.
He didn't do it in the London financial sector. He went to Edinburgh and announced it there. I've been advocating for years that UK ministers should spend more time in Scotland. If you've got responsibility for immigration, I think is it half the UK coastline is in Scotland. So you've got responsibilities that should take you north of the border, not just to Kent. If you're the Home Secretary, if you're responsible for, aviation, for example, which I think the UK minister has probably, at least as many responsibilities as the Scottish minister in that field. Go to Scottish airports and talk to them about their challenges and their troubles. And if you're the Home Secretary, you might not be responsible the Justice Secretary, you might not be responsible for the civil and criminal law in Scotland, but you are responsible for the Supreme Court. You are responsible for European legislation that affects the UK. Yeah. Go and talk to the Scottish judges and the Scottish lawyers and Scottish victims, about how that part of the legal system affects them. And I think that there was a nervousness in the Labour years, and I think a little bit of nervousness in the Cameron years, to get across the border and actually engage with people. And engagement and dialogue is the best way to deal with any crisis. And I hope these are signals that are positive. I'm not sure we would have wanted engagement necessarily from the governments that have happened since, but we're hopefully now in a situation where the grown-ups are back running some of the parties again, so that's good.
Okay. Questions? One there, yes.
Thanks for that. I think it would probably be remiss of us not to mention the B word, and that's Brexit. And I'd just like your take on, obviously, Brexit's animated a lot of passions within the Scottish nationalist sector. And to what extent do you see the European question being a bigger feature of Scottish politics in the future? Or will this be a kind of running sore? Or is this something that is firmly in the rearview mirror, as it were? Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Great question. Personally, I think one of the most interesting things about the last 8 years is the fact that 9 years now is the fact that the outcome of the Brexit referendum in 2016 hasn't really massively altered the political dial in Scotland, which has really surprised me. I mean, I thought when the Brexit vote happened 2 years after the Scottish referendum that it would probably add 10% or so onto the support for independence, and it would almost make it inevitable there would be a referendum quite soon, and that referendum might go the other way from 2014. So I've been quite surprised at how stable support for independence and not independence has been over that time. I think the next interesting thing about Brexit is that it makes putting the case for independence in a debate that was covering detail actually more difficult rather than easier. Again, partly that generation, this generation of 74 is not just about identity in politics. It's also we were very much part of the generation that came into politics or adulthood after the UK joined the European Union, and very much part of our lives. And I would watch the arguments over independence, including in 2014, and that argument that we were all still going to be in the EU together, was a powerful argument in favour of independence. The single market. We're all part of the same single market. So there's not going to be any great change here. Don't worry about it. This is not a big shock. Just a bit more control over our lives. So we're all going to be part of the same, immigration system across the whole free movement of labour across the European Union. So you don't have to worry about it. There's not going to be new borders. Not a big border wall at Gretna Green, border guards. That's just not going to happen because we're all part of the EU. We're all part of this big family. And that the next time there's a referendum in Scotland, that's not the case. The next time there's a referendum in Scotland, you're choosing a border. You can either have a border around the UK with the European Union, or you can have a border across the UK where Scotland's part of that European Union and the rest of the UK isn't. And I think at that point, when people are asked to choose a border, I think it becomes, my own view would be probably more difficult for Scottish nationalists rather than easier. Although instinctively you would have said that Brexit would help their cause, and I thought that at the time. I think economically there's an issue about whether you're part of the UK single market or the EU single market, because you sure as hell can't be part of both anymore, and that's not going to change in the near future. So I think, I think the nature of the debate has changed. I'm not sure everybody in Scotland's realised that yet, but if we ever get close to that again, it'll become quite obvious that the next Scottish referendum's not about whether you can have a smooth transition to independence, or whether you would not want that, and people can be scared into voting against it. It's going to be about choosing between two different borders.
On which note, I am afraid we have hit 7 o'clock and have to stop. This has been absolutely fantastic. I think we've learned a huge amount from questions from the audience. Thank you all so much. And all that is left for me to do is thank Jack McConnell so much for coming.
Thank you.